Edward Wu and Fei Wangfang are characters that have basically etched their names in the Kengan Omega history books. Despite their short appearance and really only having one fight, they showcase such overwhelming strength that even at this point in the manga, at chapter 241, they would still make it to the top 10 strongest characters so far. But if you've been around in the Kengan community or even thought of possible matchups on who could beat who in the series, then at one point you would have asked yourself this question. Between Fei Wangfang and Edward Wu, who would win in a fight? This question turns out to be a bit more complicated than you would initially think, but it is ultimately an interesting question that I'll be diving into in this video. But before we get into that, don't forget to like and sub if you like Kengan type of content. I don't typically do power scaling or versus battle content. I usually stick to analysis and theory videos, so if you like that type of content or you want to see more power scaling or versus content, then yeah, support the channel. But enough with that rambling, let's get on with the video. We'll start off with Fei Wangfang's power. Being one of Nico's last students who was given the final trial by Nico, we get to see just how powerful Fei Wangfang is in his fight against Wakatsuki. One of the first things we see is that Fei knows many types of martial arts, from being a master from the Ren clan Tai Chi to being a practitioner of Jujutsu and kickboxing. Fei was able to go against Wakatsuki using those techniques, however they weren't really that effective against Wakatsuki in the end, even when he was able to land those techniques. This showcase does go to show that, well, Fei is actually pretty good at martial arts in general, and was so powerful at using essentially Tai Chi that he was able to make it as an A-lister in Purgatory, which is an insane feat all on its own, since it's not even his main martial arts. In fact, none of what I've mentioned yet were any of his main martial arts. We only really get to see his main martial arts once Nico commands Fei to release the Nico style, and it is at this point in which we see Fei's true power. And that is that Fei Wangfang is probably one of the best Nico style practitioners we have seen in the series, being able to use a combination of redirection and water kata to an insanely high level. He is so good at it, in fact, that he's able to completely nullify the strikes of Wakatsuki. This is particularly impressive because Wakatsuki is probably the strongest when it comes to raw strikes. The narrator himself hints at this in Kengan Ashura, that Wakatsuki may be one of the strongest when it comes to raw blows, but we also know that Togita Oma himself said that Wakatsuki hits are heavier than Korei Ryon's, who uses removal, which is essentially a strength and speed amp. I know there are a few counter statements, like when Lo Long says that Wakatsuki is second only to Agito in power, with Julius being able to beat both of them. Or even in Kengan Ashura himself, where Sekabayashi says Julius had better raw strength than Wakatsuki, with Wakatsuki managing to beat Wakatsuki in terms of actual technique, whereas Julius had raw power. But what's important here is that all of these statements can be made relative to one another, and even if you don't want to accept the fact that Wakatsuki has the strongest blows in the series, his raw power or the strength of his blows is relative to the top of the verse, and Fei is able to completely render those blows useless with his combination of redirection and water cutter. But that's not the only thing he can actually do. We see him at one point being able to land a hit on Waka that sends him flying. Again, showing just how flexible Fei is in terms of his use of the Nico style. But the most impressive thing about Fei isn't even really the Nico style. It is what he can do with the fallen demon and the possessing spirit, when he combines them to have a completely new form, which is called the divine demon. The divine demon is probably one of the strongest amps in the entire series. In fact, it is so powerful that even though Fei never stood a chance in terms of physical strength against Wakatsuki, once he started using the divine demon, not only did he challenge that power, but Wakatsuki genuinely thought that he could lose, with Fei unleashing an onslaught of attacks on him that Wakatsuki could basically do next to nothing about. To highlight how important that statement actually is, Wakatsuki recounts all three of his losses against Agito, Oma, and Hatsumi, and to all of them he said he had never lost because of raw strength, meaning in this form, Fei Wangfang is probably one of the strongest in the entire series. But raw strength isn't all that Divine Demon comes with, it also comes with increased perception. What this means is that basically Fei can see everything and perceive everything in slow motion, giving him more than enough time to dodge attacks that he can actually see coming. We see this when Wakatsuki does a surprise attack where Fei's guard is at its lowest. Even in that condition, Fei Wangfang was able to perceive Wakatsuki's attack coming and moved just in time to dodge the blast core, though he didn't dodge it completely. However, the Divine Demon does have a huge weakness, and that is that the prolonged use of this technique would lead to Fei's death, even though Fei Wangfang is probably one of the very few people that can even use this technique in the first place because his body is just built different. Having survived the Gu ritual and many of the other trials that Nico put in front of him, Fei Wangfang built a resilient body that was capable of handling such power. But again, reckless use of that power will lead to Fei Wangfang's death, and the evidence of this is in the fight between him and Wakatsuki. However, Fei's power is incredible, that much is undeniable, possessing raw skill and sheer power at the same time. But with all of that, let's proceed on to Edward Wu. Edward Wu was the leader of the Westwood faction, a faction that rivals the Wu clan and Kurei clan. We know both of these clans engage in selective breeding to create the strongest warriors or children possible, and have been doing so for hundreds of years. Despite all of this, Edward Wu, while he was alive, was more than likely the strongest in all three of these clans, with probably being one of his most polarizing feats being his defeat of Kurei Ryan right after Kurei Ryan had essentially killed one of his clones rather easily. We see that after this, Kurei Ryan went after Edward, eventually catching up to him. After we basically cut away from that fight, we come back only to find out that Ryan had been defeated, with Edward Wu criticizing why Ryan as an assassin came to fight him alone. Now, this feat is rather controversial, mainly because we see both of Edward Wu's clones behind him when he says this, with a lot of people saying that it's more than likely the case that his clones actually helped him beat Kurei Ryan, since we did not see what happened off screen. The problem with this is that we actually see them fight Kurei Ryan later, and Edward Wu then says he will fight Kurei Ryan 3-on-1. The second problem is that Edward Wu is the only person who has evidence that he even fought Ryan, and that being the blood being on his hands specifically. However, the reason why this is such a polarizing feat is because that would mean that Edward Wu, just by doing this alone, he was more than likely the strongest in the series that we had seen so far. We do know from statements by the author and the character notes that Ryan is essentially relative to Lo Long, the king of Purgatory, since him and Ryan are compared to each other constantly. But even more than that, Lo Long is also compared to someone else, that being Jurata, who is also seen as the second king of Purgatory, who Kuroki Gensai admits in his fight when Jurata was fighting Meguro that Jurata was just as powerful as him at that point in time. You can kind of see the line here. If Edward Wu is able to defeat Kure Ryan so definitively, it means that he could do the same to Lo Long, to Jurata, and Kuroki Gensai, at least on paper. And so I definitely do get it when people are a bit skeptical of this feat. But I think the evidence leans towards the side of Edward just being that powerful. We later on get to see him fight along with his clones in the war against the Kure clan and Wu clan. And in this fight, we basically see how Edward Wu is basically untouchable the entire time, with him being able to react to 100% removal from Kure Uryu and Ryan at the same time without transforming himself. However, eventually he does, which results in him having a huge amp from Guihun. This amp allows him to essentially blitz the entire Wu clan and Kure clan alliance on his own, proving that he is the strongest one there. However, due to fatigue and poison being injected into his body, his power is later on matched by Kure Ryan, with Ryan taking advantage of those weaknesses to eventually take him down. But even so, Edward's power is still on a league of its own, even despite his loss. But it's time to get on to the matchup. Now, before we actually get into the actual fight, I do want to talk about the idea that essentially Edward Wu is guaranteed to win because he's just a lot stronger and faster than Fei. I will get into this argument later on in a lot more detail, but in terms of portrayal, which is pretty important since we don't really get that many feats for Edward and Fei, portrayal wise they seem to be relative to each other. We know this from Zai Ji's flashback in chapter 259, where he calls himself second fiddle to Edward, Yan, and Fei. We do know that Zai Ji is pretty good at actually gauging other people's power, mainly because he's one of the very few characters who's been able to sense how powerful the connector is, but also being able to perceive even small hints of his feelings. But even better than that, he's able to actually picture the gap between him and the connector, which is something that Mukaku couldn't do, Oma couldn't do. Most people that had met Shen up till that point still don't have a grasp for just how powerful Shen Wulong is. But Zai Ji seems to understand, making Zai Ji quite reliable when it comes to how he views other people in terms of power, even though he has been wrong before, with the example of course, Koga. All this to say that Edward's chances of winning are essentially not 100%. And so now I'll get into what the actual fight is and talking about the possible win cons for both fighters. To make things a bit more interesting, we will basically be going with the underground Kengan rules, mainly because they're a bit more flexible than other rule types in the series. So we'll just go with that one, meaning knockout and actually killing your opponent is viable strategies to win. We'll start off with the win conditions of Fei. And this is where I think the matchup between Edward and Fei seems to be pretty unfavorable towards Edward Wu. Edward has a pretty big problem here, and that is that we don't really see him use any techniques. At least not besides Guihun and the final technique that he uses in the end, the Wu Clan ultimate technique. Besides those two, Edward has nothing that we've even heard of, to be completely honest. Not only that, not even his clones really show much of anything. Why is this a problem? Because Fei is a Nico style practitioner, and the type of Nico style that he uses would be a particular problem for someone like Edward Wu, who seems to use brute force to get the job done. But we don't know if that would even work against Fei at all. Mainly because we know he can disperse the impact of even the strongest blows that we know of in the series, with his combination of redirection and water kata. Not only that, he would also be able to land hits on Edward Wu that would more than likely be more effective than what Edward could do to Fei. The only way Edward Wu would be able to deal with the Nico style, or Fei's Nico style to be specific, the only way Edward Wu would be able to deal with the Nico style is if he tried to force a close encounter with Fei. But we don't know if Edward Wu would even know to do that before it's too late. We know with Wakatsuki it took the experience of him losing to get to that conclusion. But also Lo Long, at least in his example with Oma, Lo Long specializes in, of course, adapting to his opponent, but also Silat, which is essentially a close-up martial arts. Edward doesn't really benefit from any of these things, and thus that would genuinely be a huge barrier for him to overcome. And this would be a pretty huge advantage for Fei Wangfang to leverage against Edward. If Fei is able to dominate the match or the fight between him and Edward early, he could simply overwhelm Edward and try to put him down for the count, even if that would be a bit more difficult. But briefly going to one of Edward Wu's win cons, and that is essentially his high endurance. Edward Wu would be probably one of the hardest people to knock out or even straight up kill. We do know that one of his clones was able to survive with a blade that had basically been sliced into his body and was still willing to actually fight. Edward's endurance would be essentially greater, if not equal to, that type of endurance. And this would present a pretty big problem for Fei, because it would mean that unless he has big moves that he has from the Nico style itself, or something that he could achieve in base form, he will have a tough time knocking Edward Wu out. And if he takes too long, Edward Wu might be able to find the weakness in the Nico style. And even though Fei could still work around this, as it's not necessarily over if you find the weakness of the Nico style, his chances of winning will just be so much more difficult. But in terms of a base-to-base fight, I do see things working out far more for Fei than it would for Edward, unfortunately. But this isn't necessarily a base-to-base fight. We still have to talk about the inevitable question that is on everyone's mind, essentially. And that is Divine Demon versus Guihun. Now, I think a lot of people think that this might be a question of which one is more powerful, but that's actually not the question that you should be asking. I think more effective would be the better way to put it, because they're probably relative when it comes to power. But I would say that Edward Wu in Guihun is probably faster than Fei Wangfang. Reason being that he was able to blitz the entire Wu clan and Korei clan alliance on his own, which is an incredible speed feat, which might be helped by the fact that they weren't expecting Edward to actually be that quick, but I'll give Edward the benefit of the doubt when it comes to that. Even if Edward's Guihun has greater speed, hell, even greater strength, the problem is that Divine Demon could probably deal with that because of the Fallen Demon aspect. Being able to perceive things in slow motion is essentially the next best thing to sensing the intent or foresight, essentially. In this case, we have a pretty interesting situation. Fei would more than likely be able to avoid Edward's attacks, even if Edward is, of course, faster than him, even if Edward is at point blank range, because of the combination of the possessing spirit and falling demon. What this also means is that Fei is more than likely gonna be able to land hits on Edward Wu. But again, it isn't even that simple, because just because Fei could actually land hits on Eddie doesn't mean that he can actually beat him. Because not only does Edward simply have insane endurance, he has time on his side. One of the biggest reasons that Divine Demon faces is just how limited of a capacity you can use it in. Meaning that Fei simply can't afford to use Divine Demon for a long time. Or if he ends up doing that, the same thing that happened to him against Wakatsuki will end up happening to him again. What this ultimately means is that we have the same thing that would basically be happening in base form, Eddie versus Fei, happening in their released forms, but only with higher stakes involved. If Fei cannot put Edward Wu down on time, he loses. All Edward really has to do is outlast Fei Wangfang, which is a win con for him. But on the other hand, if Fei can land enough hits on Edward Wu, which he's more likely to than the other way around, Fei could cause a knockout situation for himself, where he does enough damage to Edward Wu to completely knock him out, essentially winning the match. And that concludes our possible win cons for both Fei and Edward, which is actually a lot more of a complex fight than you would initially think. However, it boils down to what you think is more likely when it comes to the win cons. Personally, I could see it going either way, meaning I think this fight is rather close, but only because Fei Wangfang seems to have so much more in his toolkit, whereas Edward Wu, though even if you were to argue that he was stronger and faster than Fei, doesn't seem to have the tools to specifically deal with Fei. But with that, that concludes my entire video. If you liked the video, don't forget to like and sub, and until next time, take it easy.